Racist cop punches old black woman, finds out she's a civil rights activist. Before we dive into this powerful story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an inspiring moment like this one. In a world where justice and power collide, one moment can change everything. Today, we bring you the extraordinary story of Evelyn Johnson, a woman who has fought for justice her entire life and faced her biggest challenge yet in the very park she thought was her sanctuary. It was a warm and sunny afternoon, just like any other. The sky was a perfect shade of blue, the birds chirped harmoniously, and the soft breeze played gently with the trees that lined the edges of a peaceful neighborhood park. People were out enjoying the day, kids running on the playground, dogs wagging their tails happily, joggers passing by in rhythmic strides. And there, on a weathered bench by the edge of the path, sat Miss Evelyn Johnson. Miss Johnson was 78 years old, her face framed by thick gray hair tied back into a neat bun. She wore a simple blue dress and a warm cardigan, a pair of black shoes on her feet that had seen miles of roads. In her hands, she clutched a small leather journal, a journal that had accompanied her throughout decades of activism, a silent witness to her unyielding fight for justice. Her weathered fingers traced its edges lovingly, each page inside filled with memories, moments, and words that spoke to a lifetime of struggle, hope, and change. The park had always been her place of solace, where she could gather her thoughts and reflect on the years that had passed, years filled with protests, marches, courtrooms, jail cells, and countless speeches on the steps of city halls. She had been part of the civil rights movement, a tireless advocate for equality. Her legacy stretched far beyond the boundaries of her small neighborhood. Yet here she was, peacefully enjoying her day in a park, where no one really knew the depth of her history. To many, she was simply an old woman who had seen too many years pass. But as peaceful as this day seemed, it was about to change in an instant. As she sat on that bench, quietly observing the world around her, something caught her attention. She noticed the slow, deliberate approach of a man in a police uniform. The man was Officer Robert Smith, a tall and muscular figure with a face that looked as hard as the badge pinned to his chest. He walked toward her with a sense of authority that bordered on arrogance. He was the kind of man who enjoyed his power, someone who had learned to wear his uniform not as a protector of the people, but as a shield from the consequences of his own actions. Smith's boots crunched the gravel beneath his feet as he made his way toward Miss Johnson, his eyes narrowing with each step. To him, she wasn't a respected elder or a figure of reverence. No, to him she was just another black person taking up space where he didn't think she belonged. "Hey you!" he barked, his voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the park like a jagged blade. "What are you doing here? You've been sitting here too long. Move along." Miss Johnson, barely looking up from her journal, responded in her usual calm tone. "I'm just sitting here, officer. I'm not bothering anyone." But Officer Smith wasn't satisfied with that answer. His eyes glinted with a mix of irritation and suspicion, his jaw tightening as he stared down at her. "Don't get smart with me, lady," he spat, his voice lowering to a dangerous growl. "You people always think you can do whatever you want, wherever you want. Not today. Get up." The insult hung in the air, heavy and venomous. The "you people" was not lost on Miss Johnson. She had heard those words too many times in her life, on the front lines of protests, in the faces of segregationists and the clenched fists of racists who had tried to silence her voice. But here, decades later, those same words still stung, as if time had not moved forward at all. Miss Johnson slowly closed her journal and looked up at Officer Smith, her gaze steady, unwavering. She was no stranger to this kind of confrontation, no stranger to men like him who use their badges as weapons of oppression rather than shields of protection. "This is a public park, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I have every right to sit here." But that calm defiance only fueled Smith's anger. Without a word, he reached down, grabbing Miss Johnson roughly by the arm. The sharpness of his grip made her wince, but she didn't let it show. The strength of her resolve far outweighed the pain in her arm. "You need to learn some respect," Officer Smith hissed as he yanked her to her feet. His voice was low, dangerous. As he pulled her up, something snapped in the air. A tension, a shift. People walking by began to stop, sensing that something was wrong. Eyes turned toward the scene as the officer towered over the frail woman. And then it happened. In a flash, Officer Smith's hand shot out and he punched Ms. Johnson square in the face. There was a collective gasp from the onlookers, the sound of flesh striking flesh echoing through the air. Time seemed to slow down as Ms. Johnson stumbled back, the weight of the punch nearly knocking her off her feet. She grabbed the back of the bench to steady herself, her breath catching in her chest. For a moment she was disoriented, the world around her spinning. But then, with a strength that came from deep within, she straightened her back. She stood tall, refusing to be broken by the force of the blow. She had endured worse. Much worse. What happened next would ignite the flame of fury that had been simmering beneath the surface of this quiet community for far too long. People rushed forward, their faces etched with shock and horror. Shouts filled the air, the sounds of outrage rising like a wave. Phones were raised, cameras pointed at the unfolding scene. Officer Smith stood there, frozen, his fist still clenched at his side, his face a mask of barely concealed rage and regret. "You can't do that," one man shouted, stepping toward the officer. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Another voice chimed in, louder this time, a woman holding up her phone to capture every moment. "Did you all see that? He just hit her, an old lady." The crowd around them was growing larger by the second, people drawn in by the chaos and confusion. And yet, amid the storm of anger, Miss Johnson remained composed. Her face throbbed where the officer's fist had connected, but she wasn't about to show pain. Pain, she had learned long ago, could be endured. What mattered was dignity. She brushed herself off, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her cardigan. Her voice, when it came, was steady but laced with defiance. "I've faced worse than you, officer," she said, just loud enough for him to hear. "And I'm still here." But Officer Smith, shaken by the eruption of witnesses around him, wasn't listening. His hand went to his radio, his fingers trembling slightly as he called for backup. "Need assistance at Central Park. Situations escalating," he muttered into the radio, his voice losing the authority it had held just moments earlier. As the crowd closed in around them, Ms. Johnson began to walk. Slowly, with each step, she moved away from the bench, away from the officer who had struck her. People came to her side, offering help, but she gently waved them away. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. A storm of old memories, of scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. The punch Officer Smith had thrown wasn't just an act of violence. It was a reminder of all the battles Miss Johnson had fought, all the battles she had won. And now, she would have to fight again. In that moment, as Miss Johnson walked away from the scene of the assault, her mind drifted back to a time long ago. The memories came flooding in like a tidal wave, taking her back to the streets of Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma. Back to the days when she was not an elderly woman in a park but a young woman, standing shoulder to shoulder with giants of history. The sounds of chanting filled her ears, the smell of tear gas stinging her nose. She could see it so clearly, the sea of people marching for justice, their feet pounding the pavement in unison, their voices raised in defiance. She had been there, standing on the front lines of the civil rights movement, her heart pounding in her chest as she faced down police officers armed with batons and hatred. She had seen it all, seen men and women beaten, bloodied, and broken by the system that was supposed to protect them. She had seen friends taken away in handcuffs, their only crime being the color of their skin. And she had faced it herself, more times than she could count. But she had never backed down. "I remember the marches," she thought to herself as she walked, her steps slow and steady. "I remember standing in front of those police officers knowing that at any moment they could hurt me. But I didn't care. I had to stand. I had to fight." And now, decades later, she was facing the same fight once again. By the next morning, the video of the incident had gone viral. It was everywhere, on social media, the news, even the radio. People were outraged, and rightfully so. How could a police officer, a person sworn to serve and protect, assault an elderly woman so blatantly, so unapologetically? The story took on a life of its own, and soon, the entire city was talking about Miss Johnson. But what many didn't know was who she really was. As the media swarmed around the park where the incident had taken place, They dug deeper into Ms. Johnson's life. They discovered her past as a civil rights activist, her role in the marches, the speeches she had given, the impact she had made. Suddenly, she wasn't just a victim of police brutality. She was a symbol, a living, breathing piece of history, still fighting for justice after all these years. Officer Smith, on the other hand, found himself under intense scrutiny. The Internal Affairs Department opened an investigation into his conduct, and the pressure mounted. His colleagues distanced themselves from him, the weight of the public's outrage bearing down on him like a crushing force. Smith tried to defend his actions, claiming that Ms. Johnson had been non-compliant and hostile. But the video evidence didn't lie. People could see for themselves exactly what had happened, and there was no justification for what he had done. As the investigation dragged on, Ms. Johnson remained quiet. She had never been one for the spotlight, despite her many years of activism. But this time, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Not when there was so much at stake. With the support of her community, she decided to press charges against Officer Smith, and the community rallied around her like never before. Protests erupted outside the police station, with people holding signs that read, "Justice for Miss Johnson," and "Stop Police Brutality." The crowds grew larger with each passing day, their chants echoing through the streets. But for Miss Johnson, it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. She had seen too many people hurt by the system, too many lives destroyed by the unchecked power of authority. She wasn't going to let this slide. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. Miss Johnson sat at the front, surrounded by her supporters. Her lawyer, a sharp and determined young woman named Sarah Michaels, stood by her side. Sarah had grown up hearing stories about Miss Johnson and the role she had played in the civil rights movement. Representing her in court was not just a job, it was an honor. Across the aisle, Officer Smith sat with his own legal team, his face a mask of stoic indifference. His lawyer had prepared a defense built around the argument that Smith had been doing his duty, that he had felt threatened by Ms. Johnson's refusal to leave the park. They argued that Smith had used reasonable force to subdue a non-compliant individual. But the defense's arguments quickly unraveled under the weight of the evidence. The video of the assault was played for the jury, and the silence in the courtroom was deafening as they watched Officer Smith's fist connect with Miss Johnson's face. When it came time for Miss Johnson to take the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. She walked slowly to the witness stand, her steps measured and deliberate. But there was nothing frail about her presence. She may have been 78 years old, but her spirit was as strong as ever. As she sat down, she glanced around the courtroom, her eyes locking with Officer Smith's for just a moment before she looked away. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. "I've been fighting for justice since I was a young woman," she began, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "I've been on the front lines of protests, I've been arrested, I've been beaten, but I have never been afraid to stand up for what's right. And I won't start now." Her testimony was powerful, her words resonating with everyone in the room. She spoke not only of the assault in the park, but of the years of struggle that had come before it. The marches, the protests, the endless fight for equality. "I'm not the one on trial here," she said, her gaze shifting to the jury. "He is, and I will not let him, or anyone else, think that they can silence me." The courtroom was still, as if the very air had been pulled from the room. When the trial came to a close, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty. Officer Smith was convicted of assault and dismissed from the police force. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served. As the trial ended, Ms. Johnson stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters. But for her, this wasn't a victory. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about making sure that the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles she had. "We cannot allow fear to control us," she said softly, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Not now, not ever. We must stand together, always." And so, Evelyn Johnson's story became not just a tale of survival, but a beacon of hope. A reminder that no matter how many years pass, the fight for justice is never over. And even the smallest voice, no matter how old or weathered, can make the biggest difference. This wasn't just the story of an assault in a park. It was the story of a lifetime of resistance, resilience, and the unshakable belief that no matter the odds, you must never back down. In the end, the legacy of Evelyn Johnson wasn't written in the punches she endured, but in the battles she fought and won for justice. If this story moved you, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. The last thing I want to say is stop racism.